The Democratic Republic of Congo holds an estimated $24 trillion in untapped geological wealth. Yet, an economy built on extracting those resources has left it as one of the poorest nations on Earth. To understand this disconnect, we have to look at the timeline. In 1980, during the rule of Mobutu Sese Seko, the DRC's real GDP per capita sat above $1,000. By 2002, following decades of state collapse and conflict, that number plummeted to roughly $320. Looking at this chart, you see a catastrophic drop, followed by a slow, agonizingly partial recovery to about $496 by 2015. Standard economic frameworks cannot explain this trajectory. The classic solo growth model assumes that technological progress arrives steadily from the outside at an exogenous rate. That assumption completely breaks down in a country experiencing total institutional collapse and physical destruction. The alternative Romer model of endogenous growth fares no better. It dictates that growth is driven by a domestic research and development sector producing new ideas. The DRC's domestic R&D expenditure over this period averaged barely 0.2% of GDP. The sector simply does not exist at the scale required by the math. With standard exogenous and endogenous models mathematically disqualified, analyzing the DRC's recovery requires a different approach. We have to use semi-endogenous models, frameworks designed to account for severe developmental frictions and fading marginal returns over time. In a semi-endogenous growth model, government policy cannot permanently accelerate the long-run growth rate. Instead, policy dictates the speed and the height of the transitional recovery phase. To explain the DRC's transition, economists pit two competing semi-endogenous models against each other. The first is the modified Lucas model. It theorizes that transitional growth is driven internally by the accumulation of human capital, subject to diminishing returns. The second is the Jones model. It argues that for economies that do not innovate domestically, growth is driven externally. It relies on the diffusion of technology through global trade, scaled by the size of the population. This is an active policy dispute. Determining which of these two mechanisms actually drives growth in the DRC dictates where billions of dollars in international development funding should be allocated, whether to schools and clinics or to ports and trade infrastructure. To find the answer, we can run a rigorous econometric horse race using 40 years of data to prove whether internal mines or external trade act as the true engine of Congolese recovery. We begin with the mathematical mechanics. The modified Lucas model introduces a specific parameter into the accumulation of human capital, phi. Because phi is strictly less than 1, it creates diminishing returns. As the stock of human capital grows, the rate at which it generates new growth naturally slows down. The Jones model relies on a different engine. Here, the critical variable is A, which represents the absorption of external knowledge. For a non-innovating economy, A is proxied directly by trade openness. The Jones framework doesn't ignore education entirely, but demotes it. Under the Nelson-Phelps channel, human capital acts merely as a filter. It determines the speed at which a country can absorb and implement foreign technology brought in by trade. These two frameworks are functionally inverted. Lucas dictates that human capital is the engine, and technology is a byproduct. Jones dictates that technology diffusion is the engine, and human capital is just the transmission fluid. To test these models, we need proxy variables. We define the Human Capital Index as a composite metric combining the gross secondary school enrollment rate with national life expectancy at birth. For the Jones model, the technology proxy is trade openness, measured as imports plus exports as a percentage of GDP. We also track a physical capital proxy, measured by gross fixed capital formation. Feeding 40 years of World Bank data into these models requires a specific methodology, dynamic ordinary least squares, or DOLS. DOLS is an econometric technique that eliminates statistical noise caused by variables feeding back into each other and errors correlating over time. By isolating these feedback loops, the resulting coefficients give us a clear view of true mathematical causality rather than coincidental correlations. The DOLS results for the Lucas specification are immediate. The human capital coefficient is 23.5 and highly significant. Conversely, the physical capital proxy coefficient is negative 0.003. It is statistically indistinguishable from zero. When we test the Jones model on its own, the technology proxy completely loses its statistical significance once those dynamic corrections are applied. The fatal blow comes from the combined model. When we force both the Lucas and Jones variables into the exact same regression, the Lucas human capital terms completely encompass and overpower the Jones trait effects. This data directly disproves the standard infrastructure-first development consensus. In the DRC, pouring capital into physical investments without first establishing a baseline of human capital yields a statistical return of 0. To confirm this hierarchy, competing, non-overlapping models genuinely fits the historical data better. The result is a decisive rejection of the Jones model. The test strictly favors the Lucas human capital specification. The math also reveals a stark asymmetry in how fast diminishing returns set in. Technology accumulation in the DRC hits a wall almost immediately, with severe diminishing returns. But for human capital, the returns curve remains remarkably flat, holding at 0.96. This indicates the DRC is currently operating in a rare, high-return zone for human capital. Because the baseline is so low, marginal investments in education and health yield outsized, sustained dividends before diminishing returns ever trigger. For decades, the default international playbook for the DRC has prioritized digging. Funding has consistently favored physical extractives and infrastructure over comprehensive social services. The data proves why that fails. Returning to the Nelson Phelps channel, trade openness and imported technology are vital, but their effectiveness is strictly gated by the population's absorptive capacity. You can import state-of-the-art industrial hardware and build vast logistical networks, but funding infrastructure before educating the population required to operate and maintain it is mathematically backward. Capital accumulation itself is not the binding constraint on the Congolese economy. The constraint is the human capital with which that physical capital must interact. The data dictates a strict policy hierarchy. The foundation must be massive, front-loaded investments in secondary education and public health. Only once secured can the secondary layer of trade openness absorb foreign technology, making the top layer of physical capital productive. There is a ticking clock on this strategy. The data reveals a strictly negative coefficient for population growth. At an annual demographic expansion of over 3%, the DRC's rapidly growing population actively dilutes the available human capital per worker. The Democratic Republic of Congo has a narrow window for survival. The path to recovery requires exploiting this current period of mild diminishing returns, investing relentlessly in Congolese mines while the mathematics of growth are still overwhelmingly in their favor.